With the mic? Okay, no problem. Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. A big thank you to Audible for welcoming us into their space, providing an amazing breakfast for us. I am Gabrielle Soria. And today I'm going to be talking to you about intercultural communications. The name of the talk is Trace the Roots, and I think the theme of today's talk and kind of my own personal interests really dovetail nicely. And to give you a little bit more context why, I'm going to take you back to my roots. So I grew up actually in a very multicultural family, in a very multicultural part of the United States. I am from the Bay Area in California. And as you can see from the photo, my father is Filipino and my mother's family is Swedish. And although we all considered ourselves American, by the time I came around, I noticed really early on that there were a lot of miscommunications and frustrations in the way that we tried to connect and communicate with each other. And I'll give you one example of that. For years, and I mean until my early 20s, my mother could never understand why my Filipino grandmother didn't want to go places with her. And that's because in Filipino culture, you typically wait for an invitation to be extended at least 3 times before you accept. It's considered rude if you accept on the first time. My mom didn't know that. And, so my grandmother just would never go with her. The way that we figured this out was on my first trip to the Philippines, when I was in my early 20s. I bought a culture guide. And when I got to that line in the book, I laughed out loud. Because here was such a basic communication principle, but it had frustrated our family for over 20 years. I realized then that it was possible to really unlock communication with other cultures if you knew how to do it. And if you knew the questions to ask and how to get that information from other people. So it's not really a surprise that I wound up in a communications field or that I chose to move abroad myself. I'm sure a lot of you have noticed that our industry is becoming much more global. And this is a really good thing. If we look at AKQA, which is the office I currently work for now, we have 28 offices around the world. And if I look at the Berlin studio, we represent 25 nationalities. That's a lot of different people, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different experiences and languages and ways of approaching things. But a challenge for us has been that our industry is really slow to adapt. We've been slow to implement the infrastructure that we need to make sure that our communication flows efficiently. And inefficiencies lead to difficulty collaborating. Difficulty collaborating leads to less impactful work. Less impactful work leads to unhappy clients, agencies, and creatives. And unhappy clients, agencies, and creative lead to even more less impactful work. And this becomes a downward spiral that none of us really want. But there is a solution to this. And as you might have guessed, it comes in the form of intercultural communication. So what is intercultural communication? Each culture has a different set of values, right? If we all look back at our own backgrounds and roots, we know that we value certain things, that the people around us in our home countries and our home places place special emphasis on things. And this manifests itself in different ways, right? The way we think, the way that we talk to each other, what we say, what we don't say, and most importantly, how we say it. So intercultural communications is the process that helps us bridge those gaps and understand what those other cultures' set of values might be and how they choose to communicate. Why is it important? Well, without intercultural communications, we wind up locked in our own boxes, right? It's impossible to really connect with people. It's impossible to get to the heart of things because we're only looking at it from one perspective. And I'll give you 2 examples of this. So when I first moved to Germany, I was working in Hamburg. And I was very lucky to be partnered with a Brazilian creative. And we were kind of excited to be working in this very German agency on a very German team. And I remember one instance where my Brazilian creative partner was presenting work to our German creative director. And he had prepared this beautiful presentation. It was super visual, it was highly conceptual, lots of mood boards and beautiful visuals. But my German creative director couldn't understand the concept. For him, it wasn't logical enough. It didn't spell it out. He couldn't see what it was supposed to look like. It was just kind of this vague imagination. And he couldn't come along on that journey. And my Brazilian partner just kept trying to present it. My German creative director kept questioning him. And it became very tense. Because my partner felt like the feedback was a critique on his work. He didn't understand that for my creative director, he couldn't understand it unless it was presented in a more analytical way. And both of them wound up walking away from the interaction, feeling like this was a reflection on the other's personality, as in, oh, that guy is difficult to work with, rather than a cultural difference. Another example. There was a German agency that was working with a company in Sweden. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Swedes have a custom called fika, where they stop their workday, they pull out the coffee, everyone puts their work aside, and they all come together to talk and sort of unwind for a few minutes. So for this particular company, they did a work-wide fika at a certain set time. But the German company kept scheduling calls and meetings during this time. And they couldn't understand why the Swedes would never show up. But communication is not always simple back and forth and conversation, right? It's also respect for our rituals, our habits, the things that are culturally instilled in us. And so this is a good example of non-communicative intercultural communication. So now that I've kind of depressed you with how difficult it can be to work in an international office, I want to present to you 5 different key skills or traits that you can maybe work with yourself or with your team to enhance. The first one is awareness. If we consider that first example I gave, right, of my family, if my mother had known to look for this particular point of etiquette, or if my grandmother had known to tell her, hey, this is how it is, or best of all, if my father, who was acting as the intermediary between these two people, had known to maybe point it out and help her settle into the family a little bit more easier, they could have avoided years of social awkwardness and deepened their relationship much quicker. So the first thing we need to do is to expect differences and anticipate challenges. And one way to consider doing that is maybe getting in the habit of asking each new person you work with, how do you like to communicate? How do you like to communicate? Do you prefer things to be direct? Do you prefer things to be written via email? Do you prefer to talk face-to-face? What are you expecting when I come to talk to you? Now, I don't say that this one question is going to open and unlock everything, but what it will do is just sort of open a conversation. And that's what you really want to start doing with your team, is getting people to talk about how you like to communicate, what you're expecting, and how we can move forward. The second thing to start doing is really listening. I think a lot of times we listen to hear, we don't listen to understand. And so one thing I can really recommend, I call it listening between the lines. Especially when you've got a lot of people for whom English is not a first language, or if you're working in German, you have people who are learning German or in the process of language learning. There can be a lot of things that sort of fall through the cracks. And listening between the lines means that you're really listening for what people are intending to say and not necessarily what they are saying, right? So you're listening for meaning, not on the surface. Maybe their culture prohibits them from being too direct, right? And so the true meaning of what they're saying is couched in a lot of softer words. Or maybe on the opposite side, maybe their culture is used to being very direct. And if you come from an indirect culture, maybe you feel like this sort of directness is an attack, when really it's sort of meant to be assertive and to get to the point quicker. So one way to do this is, instead of walking out of a conversation where you think, hey, I've got this right, I know exactly what was said here, maybe make it a recap. Maybe ask people, let me make sure I got this right. This is an active listening technique. And what it does is it helps you make sure that everybody is on the same page with you when you leave a conversation. And you'll be surprised, a lot of times people have completely different understandings of what went down in that conversation. Or maybe people are offended or hurt or have some sort of feeling that you can unlock with a statement like, let me make sure I got this right. You feel this, or you said this. The third is curiosity. One thing I really love about my team right now is that we've gotten really good at asking each other and doing it really often. How do you do blank in blank? It can be as frivolous as, how do you do holiday parties in San Francisco? It can be something more serious, like how do you do performance reviews in Brazil? And what this allows you to do is get a sense from the other person of what they're expecting, what their experiences are like. But you're also creating an atmosphere of respect where you say, hey, I value the way that you used to do things. I value your perspective. I value the background that you have. And let me try and accommodate that here in this new space together. I think it's really important when you work with international teams that you don't always force people to conform to one thing. That you can say, I understand that things are done differently in other places. Why don't you tell me about that? So far, we've put a lot of emphasis on the other people in your teams, right? But I think as an international person working in an international office, it's also really important to do some self-reflection and to consider, okay, how do I communicate? What can I lose? What can I gain here? So as you check yourself, as you kind of investigate, think about, why do I do the things that I do? Do I like the things that I do? What has been an influence from my background, my roots? And maybe, like me, you have a bunch of different influences, yeah? Like I studied abroad, a certain place, or my parents come from 2 different countries. So what are all the little nuances that sort of shape you, even if you think, oh, I'm British, or oh, I'm American? There's always external influences working on us. And I'll give you one example of this. I'm American, as you can tell. And Americans love small talk, right? We hate a silence. We're going to sit there. We'll fill it with nonsense as long as we can. It makes us feel comfortable. But for other countries and other cultures, sometimes our small talk makes them uncomfortable or really annoys them. And I realized when I moved to Hamburg that me sitting in the kitchen talking nonsense was actually really annoying everybody else in the office. And so when I did this exercise on myself, I said like, hey, I actually don't like small talk. I find it annoying to procure all of this nonsense. Other people find it annoying and uncomfortable, and maybe that reflects poorly on me as a colleague. This can be something that I lose. And I started to train myself to become more comfortable with just being in silence, with a simple greeting. So once you've sort of found out these things, maybe start telling people, right? You've asked people how they communicate. Now it's your turn to say, this is how I communicate, or this is what I'm expecting. And to really own that. It's not a bad thing, right? If we all come from different places and we all have different approaches. But you can say, like, look, I'm sorry, I'm really direct. Like, I'm going to do this and this. Or I make it a point to really talk to my team members and say, like, how do you like to receive feedback? Or how do you like to receive praise? Because some people are really uncomfortable with compliments. Some people are really uncomfortable with like really direct confrontation. And so the more you talk about this, the more you learn about yourself and the more you learn about others. And finally, I think the most fun is celebration, right? There's a reason that we've all come across the world. There's a reason that you've hired international people for your team. Is this a really good thing? And I think a lot of times we focus on the more negative aspects, the bigger challenges, the obstacles, when in fact we should be making it fun. And the way that we make it fun is just by telling our team members to embrace new perspectives, celebrating achievements and unlocking things, and building an atmosphere of respect and community, really, when it gets down to it. One thing our office has done is we put up some whiteboard paper, and some of the people in this room really started to put together like a little language session, right? So it came from people saying, hey, I want to learn German. It came from our German copywriter saying, hey, I actually want to learn other languages. And it wound up becoming like a big, a nice little ritual for people. You know, they would come over with their coffees. We would identify fun phrases that people wanted translated. You get to see similarities between different languages and learn a little bit about people's backgrounds. My previous agency in Hamburg, they made a really big point about always celebrating our holidays. So I remember I came in one day and there was a big spread out in the reception for Persian New Year. I had never celebrated Persian New Year before. I didn't even know there was a Persian person on our team. So this was great for me, right? I said, oh, okay, like this is cool. I got to eat some good food, and that person got to feel like, hey, I might be really far from my home, but I still get to honor this part of my culture. So you can do it through music, you can do it through celebrations, but what you're really doing is just making people feel welcome. And that can go a long way to sort of bridge communication gaps and build your community. So we have awareness, listening, curiosity, self-reflection, celebration. And as you sort of introduce these skills to your team, you know, make sure that you're doing regular pulse checks. Am I listening? Are we expecting challenges? Are we communicating these things enough? Are we being curious? Are we sharing? Are we learning about ourselves? Are we celebrating everybody on our team? And as you start to do that, you'll start to see your team come under one roof, come all together and start communicating within the same walls. And that's really what you want to do, right? That's the crucial thing here, is that we're saying like, okay, you can speak differently, you can talk in different ways, but we're all understanding what the other one is trying to get to. We're all on this journey together. And as you do that, hopefully you'll notice more efficiencies start to happen, which in turn leads to better collaborations, which in turn leads to more impactful work, which in turn leads to happier clients, agencies, and creatives, which in turn leads to even more impactful work. And at the end of the day, that is exactly what all of us are here to do, right? Make impactful work. That's my talk.